The other 3 had gone up an hour before I finished. That was the arrangement. Survey day ran until the light through the cut skylights went golden flat, which meant roughly 1400 hours at this latitude, and everyone climbed the access ladder in a body and went back to the camp for food and a debrief. I usually followed. That afternoon, I was 3 items behind on the unremarkable objects register, and behind is behind, so I told Selday I would catch up, and I sat down on the folding stool beside the secondary shelf unit in the lower Ossuary passage and got on with it. The passage was quiet in a way that rooms with stone walls and no ventilation get quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but settled. The skylights the survey team had cut in the first week still let in good light at that hour, angled and clean, dropping 2 bright columns onto the flag floor 5 meters from where I sat today. Dust motes moved in them. The air smelled of dry mineral and old pressed clay, the smell every predecessor site I have ever worked carries underneath everything else, under the cutting fluid and the survey markers and the chalk. I had catalogued 33 items that day. The 34th was the tablet. It had been in the collection since the Vithindel survey opened, 8 years before I was contracted, which put it at roughly a decade in formal custody, though its history before that was documented back almost 8 centuries in institutional records. It was a 12 centimeter by 8 obsidian rectangle, smooth on both faces except for a dense field of incised predecessor script too fine for unassisted reading, and it had a seam. A clean seam, running all the way around the tablet's perimeter at a depth of roughly 2 millimeters, as though the object had been constructed in 2 halves that had then been fused. That seam had never parted. 34 scholars, for separate Heritage Commission inspections, 2 attempts with precision instrument suites. None of it had produced so much as a shift in the fused join. The tablet was solid. The standard notation in the register described it as a sealed reference object of unknown function, pending further material analysis, which is the formal way of saying that no one knew what it was and it had not cooperated with anyone's attempts to find out. I photographed it, logged the registration number, and set it on my knee to check the seam condition against the last inspection notes. The notes said the seam was clean. They were wrong. There was mineral deposit along the lower edge, the kind of pale calcite bloom that forms in poorly ventilated stone interiors over a long period of undisturbed air contact, and it had built up enough to make the seam look partially obscured in the last set of photographs. That was not a conservation problem, but it was a documentation inaccuracy, and documentation inaccuracies are my specific problem to solve. I took out the soft cloth from my kit pocket, the one I use for lens surfaces, fine weave, not abrasive, and I began working the deposit out of the seam edge with the corner of it. Careful strokes. The calcite came away cleanly. The obsidian surface under it was unmarked. I was not thinking about anything particular. I was looking at the seam and working the cloth, and somewhere in the automatic quiet of the task I began to hum. I have done this my whole working life. It is not a melody, not exactly, 2 notes, a low one and a half step above it, held in sequence and repeated, something my mother did when she was concentrating and something her mother did before her, a family habit so unremarkable that I stopped noticing it in myself somewhere in my 20s. In a quiet room it is barely audible. In the lower Ossuary passage of Vithindel's mound, with the light coming flat through the skylights and the dust settling and my hands moving on the cloth, I was making that sound and did not know it. The seam parted. Not broke. Not cracked. It opened, a smooth, precise, deliberate separation along the full perimeter, the 2 halves of the tablet disengaging from each other with a faint breath of released pressure, like a sealed vessel venting equilibrium. The sound it made was less than a whisper. I heard it clearly because the room was very quiet. I stopped humming. I looked at what was in my hands. The tablet had opened to roughly 45 degrees. The inner face of the lower half was inscribed, the same fine predecessor script on the outer faces, but denser, columns packed tight, and in the center of the upper half's inner face there was a circular inset, roughly 3 centimeters across, of a material that was not obsidian. It was pale, almost translucent, the color of old unbleached paper held to light. It was also lit from within. Faintly. Just enough. I sat with the open tablet in my hands for a moment that I cannot time accurately. I know I looked at the skylights. The light was still coming in at the same angle, still clean, so I had not moved into some other version of the afternoon. I looked back at the tablet. The inner light was still there, steady, not pulsing. I set the cloth on the stool beside me. I held the tablet with both hands, level, open. The pale insert spoke. Not in predecessor language. In standard, not synthesized, not approximate, but standard in the full sense, grammatically clean, pitched low and even, with the quality of something that had been waiting to say a specific thing for a very long time and was saying it now without hurry. First queen of the sealed word. 6 words. I know what I did next because I can see it clearly when I try. I lowered the tablet carefully until it rested on my knees, and I sat on the stool in the lower ossuary passage, and I looked at the pale insert for a while without moving. The light from it did not change. The 2 columns of daylight moved a fraction as the sun shifted. The dust motes moved in them. I was not afraid. That is not false modesty. I was not calm either, not exactly, but afraid is the wrong word. I was sitting with a very large fact, and I did not yet know its dimensions, and my instinct in those situations is to sit still and let the fact become more legible rather than to react to its first impression. What became legible, over the next several minutes, was this. The tablet was inscribed on all interior surfaces. Not the scattered impression of a personal record, but a systematic one, column organized, cross-referenced at the margins, the kind of structure a person uses when they are encoding information meant to be retrieved by someone else under specific conditions, not stumbled upon by accident. The predecessor civilization that had occupied this site had left records in a dozen formats across the 6 excavated structures of Vithindle's mound, and none of them were organized like this. This was an archive index, a master catalogue, something that told whoever held it where the other records were, what they contained, and how they were meant to be read. The pale insert spoke again, still without hurry. The contents are available to you. Say when you are ready. I said, not yet. The insert went quiet. The tablet stayed open. I reached for my kit and took out the small secondary recorder I carry as backup, because my primary was already docked to the field station upstairs, and I began to document what I was holding. I photographed both interior faces and sections, getting the inscription columns as cleanly as the light allowed. I noted the material of the pale insert and its dimensions. I noted the quality of the light it was producing. I noted that the seam showed no deformation from the opening. It had parted cleanly and could, I thought, be closed again, though I did not try. I noted the words it had spoken, and I noted the words I had spoken in reply. My comms unit chimed. Selday's voice, from the surface. Dara, we are starting without you if you're not up in 10. I said, I found something. There was a pause. Selday has been on survey teams for 22 years, long enough to know that I do not say that casually. He said, how big is it? I looked at the tablet in my hands. 12 centimeters by 8. Palm-sized. The kind of thing you could carry in a coat pocket without anyone noticing. Not physically large, I said. Come down when you can. I set the comms unit back in my kit. I held the tablet and looked at the pale insert, and the pale insert held its light, and the afternoon continued at its own pace around both of us. I thought about the 2 notes. I thought about my mother at her desk, cataloguing survey slides from the Peelith dig season, the same low hum barely audible over the fan of the old projector unit. I thought about her mother, whom I had met only twice, a woman who catalogued botanical specimens on a colonial charter world for 40 years and hummed while she worked and dyed with ink on her fingers. I had not known either of them as women who carried anything ancient. They were careful, quiet people who catalogued things and went home. I thought about the 33 scholars who had held this tablet before me and had not opened it, and I thought that they had been careful and quiet people too, most of them, and that the difference between them and me was not intelligence or training or the quality of their attention. The difference was a 2-note sound that I had learned from a woman who had learned it from a woman, and that the predecessor civilization that built this archive had apparently encoded into its index key 800 years ago and then set it on a shelf and waited. That is the part that stays with me. Not the opening. Not the words. The waiting. 8 centuries in the unremarkable-objects register. 8 centuries of examinations and inspections and instrument suites and scholars running their thumbs along the sealed seam in the particular frustrated way people run their thumbs along sealed seams. 8 centuries of patience in the lower ossuary of a partially excavated site on a world that most of the Academy still considered secondary priority. The tablet had not been stubborn. It had been specific. I heard Selday on the access ladder, and then his boots on the flagstone, and then he came around the shelf unit and stopped. He looked at the open tablet in my hands and at the pale light coming from its center, and he stood there for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating. Right, he said finally. Yes, I said. He came and crouched beside the stool and looked at the insert. He did not touch the tablet. He asked what it had said, and I told him. He was quiet for a while after that. What does that mean? He said. First queen of the sealed word. I think it means I have the key to the archive, I said. The full archive. Whatever the predecessor civilization stored here that isn't in the 6 structures we've excavated. How large is the archive? I looked at the inner face of the tablet. The columns of inscription were very dense and very small, and I had not yet read them, and the tablet had told me it would tell me the contents when I was ready, and I was not yet ready. I don't know, I said. I'll find out. We sat in the lower ossuary for a while, the 3 of us, Selde, me, and the thing in my hands, while the light in the skylights went gold and then flat and then began to fade toward the color that means the sun is going. I closed the tablet eventually. The seam closed. The light went out. It sat in my palms looking exactly as it had in the unremarkable objects register for 8 years. Smooth, sealed, a pale calcite bloom beginning to form again at the cleaned edge, as though it were already accumulating patience for the next weight. I held it carefully on the way up the ladder. I held it carefully across the flat ground to the camp. I sat with it wrapped in clean linen in the document lockbox while we ate, and afterward I took it out and held it again, and I hummed the 2 notes, and it opened, and I said I was ready, and it began. I am still reading. I expect I will be reading for some time. My mother would have found that funny, I think. The idea that somewhere in the 2-note sounds she used to make over her slide projector, there was a key. She was not a woman who thought of herself as carrying anything. She was a woman who catalogued things carefully and went home. So was I, until yesterday afternoon. I am still that woman. I am also, apparently, the first queen of the sealed word, which is not a title I asked for and is not one I entirely know what to do with yet. But the archive is open, and I am the one who can read it, and that will have to be enough to start with. It is, I find, more than enough.